Hello everyone, it's Mark Goodacre here. Welcome to the NT Pod, the podcast all about the New Testament and Christian origins. It's episode 91 and today we're looking at the stories of Jesus' resurrection. From time to time I get asked about extended episodes of the NT Pod, and this is one of those. It runs a bit longer than usual, 45 minutes or so, and it's me talking about the stories of Jesus' resurrection as part of a series which I gave back in July 2016 for the Biblical Archaeology Society in a series called Who Was Jesus? I'll chat a little bit more at the end about that, and I'll also look forward to a forthcoming live episode of the NT Pod, but in the meantime I hope you enjoy the lecture. It's a difficult one, even deciding whether you should tackle the resurrection stories in a series of lectures that's essentially about the historical Jesus. And some historical Jesus books simply don't look at the resurrection at all. They say this is something outside of history. They say it has nothing to do with mainstream historical Jesus research. It's in the realm of faith, and therefore we shouldn't look at it. And to be honest with you, when I used to teach historical Jesus at Duke, I think for the first 5 or 6 years that I took the course, I didn't touch on the resurrection stories because I was convinced by this kind of argument that you, as a true historian, have to look at publicly witnessed events that you can analyse with public evidence and public argumentation. And I felt that as soon as you're getting into the resurrection stories, you're in a different realm of discourse. But I changed my mind. And one of the reasons I changed my mind about it is that I was reading a piece by a scholar called Francis Watson where he said the resurrection stories, whatever you make of them, are part of the story of the historical Jesus. And the reason they're part of the story of the historical Jesus is that it is irrefutable, whatever you think happened, it is irrefutable that early Christians believed that Jesus was raised from the dead. That, therefore, is a key datum in the earliest perceptions about who Jesus was, to take our title this week, Who Was Jesus? And therefore, it's quite an important part of the person's identity, of their reception, of who they become in the discourse, to ask about their afterlife. So if you read a biography of Winston Churchill, it doesn't just stop when he dies, right? It carries on with his legacy. And so, whatever you think about what happened on that first Easter morning, it is part of Jesus' legacy, part of the historical Jesus' legacy, to say what went on beyond his life. So with that little apology, we'll look at the resurrection stories. Do we do a whistle-stop tour through all the resurrection stories in the New Testament and go 1 Corinthians, Mark, Matthew, Luke, John, and then perhaps even Gospel of Peter? And when I first prepared this handout, I started doing this, and it went to about 15 pages. So I had a rethink, and I thought, okay, how do we look at these things as historians? I thought, when you're a historian, you basically have to go for the earliest source material, don't you? So what I decided it would be most interesting to do would be to go to the 2 earliest accounts of the resurrection and see if those give us clues about how we should proceed in this difficult topic. So although I'll touch briefly on Matthew, Luke and John, I don't think I'll touch on Gospel of Peter, but briefly on Matthew, Luke and John, we'll mainly focus on 1 Corinthians and Mark. Therefore, if you want to bring up questions about Matthew, Luke and John or Gospel of Peter in our question session, that's absolutely great. So I hope that works. I thought it's kind of more interesting to go into a couple of texts in detail and dig into them than it is to just run through a whole bunch of texts and give them 5 minutes each. So the very earliest account of the resurrection, surprisingly, isn't in the Gospels at all, it's in Paul. And it's one of those things where we can be eternally grateful to the Corinthians. The Corinthians were a contentious bunch. They argued about everything. They argued about the Eucharist, they argued about divorce, they argued about sex, they argued about missionary practice, they argued about gifts of the Spirit, they argued about anything you can think of. And that's wonderful for us. Because if they hadn't been so contentious, Paul would not have written these detailed discussions of, refutations of, expositions of issues that they were struggling with. And thank the Lord they were arguing about resurrection, because if they hadn't been arguing about resurrection, Paul would never have thought to write 1 Corinthians 15, in which he prefaces a discussion of the general resurrection of all believers in the future with an account of Jesus' resurrection. So we should all be terribly grateful to the contentious Corinthians. So in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul writes something that is pure gold historically, because it is incredibly early when we're looking at these materials. Bear in mind that quite often when we're doing history, we're looking at documents that are hundreds of years after the events. When we're looking at 1 Corinthians 15, we're looking at something that's within a generation of the events that Paul is talking about, where the people that he mentions are still alive. How do I know that? Because Paul says so. At one point in 1 Corinthians 15, he says, by the way, these 500 people that saw Jesus, most of them are still alive. Some have died, but most are still alive. So we know that these eyewitnesses that Paul is talking about are still alive when he's writing. Which really deepens the mystery when it comes to what it is that they actually saw. We're not talking about later, legendary, embellished accounts. We're talking about people who apparently thought they had seen Jesus raised from the dead. This is why this is such a fascinating mystery. So in 1 Corinthians 15:3, Paul begins going back over what appears to be the general church's, I don't want to say catechism or creed, but general church tradition about the resurrection, something that already appears to be kind of crystallized in a received format. And it's so important, I'll read it out loud. It's the first thing on the handout. For I handed on to you as of first importance what I in turn had received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to someone untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecute the church of God. So 1 Corinthians, arguably one of Paul's earliest letters. I think it was written in the early 50s in the first century. Worth reminding ourselves that Paul's letters are all occasional. They're written in response to particular situations, particular arguments, and all the rest of it. Now, what does Paul actually do here? What does he reveal? Several things. He reveals what is shared by him and the other early Christians, number one. He reveals what was shared with him from the first. That itself takes us back, I think, to the 30s. If we assume that Paul was called, converted in the 30s of the first century, which is a plausible reading of the Epistle to the Galatians where Paul dates these things, then it means that Paul may well have heard this tradition right back in the 30s. This is taking us right into the nest area of early Christianity. He also says it's what early Christians thought was of first importance. This isn't just Paul making stuff up, this is Paul repeating what other people have said. And so it's our earliest account of the resurrection by a long way. Now let's work through what Paul says by going in reverse. Because one of the strangest things about Paul's account is that he's in it. Whenever you're dealing with Paul, Paul usually is in the story somewhere. My teacher, Ed Sanders, often used to say that whatever Paul used to think, whatever anybody else did, he did it better. You know that song, anything you can do, I can do better? That was kind of Paul's song, according to E.P. Sanders. It's fascinating that Paul makes his own experience of the resurrected Jesus the climax of the story. I doubt other people told the story this way. So when he says, I received as of first importance what I also handed on to you, I doubt that people like Peter and John, who were telling the same story in Jerusalem, I doubt they said, and then last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to Paul. I don't think that was in their story. I think their story had ended before that bit. And it's interesting that Paul is self-consciously seeing himself as being out of the normal story. So he says, last of all, as to one untimely born. In other words, you've got all these resurrection appearances, and then you've got Paul just out of nowhere. 2 or 3 years later, something like that. You can see why people were suspicious of Paul, can't you? Because even in his own rhetoric, you can tell that he's conscious that he isn't one of the earliest apostles. He's not one of those people that saw Jesus in this first round that he's narrating here. He saw him kind of later on, as to one untimely born. And it does look like people did argue about whether or not Paul had seen the resurrected Jesus. There's a fascinating bit a little earlier in 1 Corinthians. In 1 Corinthians 9, he says, "Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my work in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you." What that suggests is that there were people contending that Paul was not an apostle. And if you notice how closely Paul aligns being an apostle with having seen the risen Jesus, then we can see why that's such a big deal. Paul takes his authority, his apostolic authority, from the idea that he has seen the risen Jesus. There's an interesting mixture there, I think, of something that Paul shares with others in early Christianity and something where he differs with lots of others. I think that it was pretty broadly accepted that if you were an apostle, you had to have seen the risen Jesus, that you had to have been commissioned by the risen Jesus in order to preach to the church and to everybody else. And Paul kind of knows of this connection, agrees with this connection, and the controversial bit is that he thinks he's seen the risen Jesus as well. It's fascinating when you read Acts of the Apostles, because in Acts of the Apostles, when Paul sees Jesus in Acts chapter 9 on the road to Damascus, it's described as a vision. It's not part of the resurrection appearances, which have all finished by Acts chapter 1. Luke kind of schematizes things. So we end the period of the resurrection appearances in Acts 1, then we go into the period of the early church, and then when Paul sees Jesus, it has to be a vision. It's not described as an appearance of the risen Jesus. Paul would have begged to differ with Luke, I think. Difference in emphasis there between the two. And notice that here in 1 Corinthians 15, in verse 9, he says, "For I am the least of the apostles." He doesn't just say, "I am the least of the apostles." It's connected. He's saying that, as you can see, I saw Jesus, therefore I'm an apostle, but I'm going to be humble about it. I'm the least of the apostles because I saw Jesus out of time. So the reason why I'm dwelling so much on Paul's vision of Jesus is, does this provide a clue to what Paul thinks about other experiences of Jesus? Because if Paul is seeing Jesus out of time, if he's seeing Jesus, in his view, some years maybe after the first apostles saw Jesus, do we have to reckon with the idea that Paul has, for want of a better term, a kind of spiritual resurrection story? And if he's seeing Jesus in some kind of vision, a bit like it's depicted in Acts chapter 9, is that how Paul also thinks Jesus appeared to the other earlier apostles? And this is one of the key questions about 1 Corinthians 15. Are all of these resurrection appearances in Paul's mind the same kind of thing? Are they visionary experiences of what we might want to call, for a better term, a spiritual resurrection? Or does Paul think that the earliest apostles saw a physical resurrected Jesus, a bodily resurrected Jesus? And that's the really interesting question in 1 Corinthians 15. Even with this beginning bit in 1 Corinthians 15, you could see it go either way. It could be that Paul thought that the earliest Christians saw a bodily raised Jesus that they could touch, who ate fish like he does in Luke's Gospel. Or it could be that Paul thought that they all saw Jesus in the same way he did, as a kind of spiritual being. It's also not impossible that Paul thought he had seen a physical, bodily Jesus in front of him that he could touch, talk to, and all the rest of it. And the difficulty with the whole chapter, I encourage you to read the whole of 1 Corinthians 15, is Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 is defending the physicality of Jesus' resurrection. He thinks that Jesus was raised bodily. He was resurrected in the body. So you might think, well, that settles it. Raised in the body. The problem is, what does Paul mean by body? And I'm not just messing about here and, kind of trying to split hairs. Because Paul, at one stage in 1 Corinthians 15, starts saying, well, different people, different entities come with different kinds of bodies. And he talks about the kind of bodies that a star has, for example. You think, oh, hold on a minute, that's not like a physical flesh and blood body, is it? So to Paul, the term body doesn't just mean flesh and blood. And it's entirely possible that when Paul says body, he means something other than the flesh and blood meat box, if you like, of human existence. It's a really tough one to get our heads around. Shall we have a look at the earlier bit of 1 Corinthians 15? Shall we work back from that appearance to Paul? Paul appears to group the appearances into two separate sections. So first of all, we have an appearance to Cephas, who of course is Peter. Paul always calls him Cephas, except on one occasion when he calls him Peter, which is how we know that it's the same person. There's Bart Ehrman once argued that Peter and Cephas were two different people, but he changed his mind. He thinks that they're the same person now. But Cephas, Aramaic for rock, Peter, Greek for rock, first one in the list. And Paul says that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12, then to the 500 all at once, some of whom are dead, but most who are still alive. Then he says he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. There's lots of interest in that list, isn't there? First thing of real interest, Cephas and James appear to be the key people running the show in Jerusalem, elsewhere in the New Testament. So when you go to the epistle to the Galatians, already in Galatians 1, Peter and James are the two people that Paul goes to see in Jerusalem. Galatians 2, it's Peter, James, and John are the three. This has to be James, the brother of Jesus. It's not James, the son of Zebedee. So we've got these two as probably the chief apostles in the early Christian movement. It's interesting that they also each have a kind of connected group. Cephas and the 12, James and all the apostles. Is the James group a kind of secondary group of, if you like, subsidiary apostles? Lots of people, if you ask the person on the street with a kind of only vague knowledge of early Christianity, who were the apostles, they would think we meant the 12, wouldn't they? You know, Peter, James, John, Andrew, Bartholomew, Philip, all those people. But clearly here, there's one group called the 12, and there's another group called all the apostles, which is interesting in itself. Elsewhere in the New Testament, this picture is corroborated. So we do have other people described as apostles elsewhere in the New Testament. One of the most fascinating examples of this, and I could spend the next 3 hours talking about them. I've got an article written about them. But is Andronicus and Junia in Romans 16:7, who Paul describes as apostles and says that they were in the movement before he was, which is really, really interesting. He says they were in Christ before me, so they presumably had seen the risen Jesus too. So there are lots of resurrection appearances to apostles that we don't know much more about, except that they get these brief references elsewhere in the New Testament. The mention of the 12 is really interesting, though. It shows that Paul was aware of a group of apostles known as the 12. Had the term the 12 become quite stylized by this point? Because after all, if the gospel narratives, it's not 12 anymore, is it? It's 11. And in fact, Matthew and Luke, both great pains at the end of their gospels to call them the 11. It only comes in Matthew and Luke, that term, the 11, because Judas has dropped out. Interesting that Paul refers to them, and it's our earliest historical evidence also for the existence of a group called the 12. Ed Sanders thinks that's really interesting because Jesus has chosen 12 people, presumably who will be the guys who are reigning in his restored Israel, the 12 representing the renewed Israel, 12 tribes of Israel. And so that might actually be really early historical evidence for Jesus as a kind of restoration prophet, somebody who wanted to see a restored Israel. It's also interesting to ask the question about how these appearances relate to the ones we see in the Gospels. Peter is mentioned in the Gospels as seeing the risen Jesus, but James is not. James, the brother of Jesus, completely absent from the Gospel resurrection narratives. And this is one of the great mysteries of early Christianity. Why is James so prominent when you read Paul's epistles and so much a minor character in the Gospels? If only Paul's letters had survived, we would have no idea how unimportant James would have appeared to other people. I mean, reading Paul's epistles, you just assume that James was the top dog, all the way through, along with Cephas. Read the Gospels and James isn't that at all. And it's a difficult one. Some people think that James spent Jesus' mission being a little bit haughty and a little bit superior and not quite wanting to associate with Jesus, thinking that he's mad and this kind of thing. But the resurrection changed everything. And that's a completely plausible reading of the evidence. But another plausible reading of the evidence is that the Gospels play down James's role. And the reason why that is a plausible account of the evidence is that they don't even mention the resurrection appearance to James. And they could have told a wonderful story there, because they've got the story about James being negative earlier on in Jesus' mission, but nothing about him being positive afterwards. One enjoyable possibility is, the story in Luke 24 of the road to Emmaus? One of the two guys that meets Jesus is named as Cleopas, and we know from other early Christian texts that he was Jesus' uncle. Could be that he was walking with James. It may be that that is an appearance to James, and that's why Luke is quiet about it. That's one possibility. The more simple possibility is Cleopas' wife, who, as usual with wives in this period, is unnamed, as I complained about the other day. But you never know, it could be James. Perhaps, speaking of women, the most striking thing about Paul's account, and this is the thing where, we feminists find our blood beginning to boil a bit. Where are the women in 1 Corinthians 15? Is this a typical early Christian outrage where Paul has basically just written the women out of the story? Or doesn't he know about them? It's a tough one, because either could work. It could be that Paul thinks, I know all about these women who said they saw Jesus. I know about Mary Magdalene and Mary of James and Joseph. I know these people, but I'm going to concentrate on the men. It could be that. Or does he just not know? It's a really tough one, because the evidence on Paul and women goes both ways. At his worst, Paul can sound like an utter misogynist, and he says some quite appalling things that have really set the church back in all sorts of ways for the last 2,000 years. But equally, he has these moments where you see him quite sublime and almost prophetic in the role that women play in his churches. So it's impossible. We can't just say, oh, Paul was an unmitigated sexist and therefore he's written the women out of the story. Could be that. But it could equally be that he simply doesn't know about those appearances to Mary Magdalene and so on. But the biggest question, I think it's right to call it the biggest question. The biggest question of all about 1 Corinthians 15 is there an empty tomb there or not? Now, I touched on this briefly yesterday. 1 Corinthians 15:3 does have the line, that he was buried. It is interesting because Paul doesn't just say Jesus was dead and buried. He says that he died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures. The fact it gets its own special bullet point just makes me think that Paul may be implying an empty tomb, because we've got Jesus dying, we've got Jesus buried, then we've got Jesus resurrected. If Paul knew full well that Jesus' body remained in whatever tomb or grave it was put in, would he have made a point of saying that Jesus was buried? Because surely it's irrelevant data if the Jesus that he thinks everybody saw was a kind of spiritual apparition. You don't need to mention the grave. In fact, if anything, it's distracting to mention the grave if you've got a purely spiritual resurrection. Why do you want to mention the grave? Because then the reader is thinking, grave, but that's where Jesus' corpse is. What about the risen Jesus? So I think even though it's inconvenient historically, because it would be easier to explain the stories if Paul thought Jesus' body was left behind, I think it makes better sense of the kind of the narrative flow, if you like, if Paul thinks that Jesus' body was physically raised from the dead. But that, of course, raises all sorts of questions. How on earth could he think that? Why did he think that? So, shall we have a look at Mark 16 to see if that will help us answer some of these issues? Now, before we look at Mark chapter 16, we have to deal with the most fascinating piece of textual criticism of the New Testament. Now, some people, when they hear the term textual criticism, they kind of glaze over and get bored. But you shouldn't do it this. We shouldn't do it ever. I mean, textual criticism is actually fascinating. In fact, when I lecture on textual criticism to my introductory New Testament class, I quote various people saying, oh, textual criticism is so boring, it's so uninteresting, and then I give them 3 key texts. The first one I give them is The Number of the Beast, which in our earliest text is not 666, it's 616, and I project that on the screen. Number 2, I show them The Woman Taken in Adultery from John's Gospel, which is not in the earliest text of John's Gospel. And third, I give them this, just to prove textual criticism is interesting. The thing is, Mark 16, verses 9 to 20, is absent from 2 of our best Greek witnesses. Not just random later texts from the medieval period that might have happened to have run out of ink when they were at the end of Mark 16, verse 8, but 2 of our earliest Greek manuscripts. You get to Mark 16, verse 8, and there's no more. Now that is really significant, the fact that it's missing in early Christian texts. It is present in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of others, but it's the absences when you get to text criticism that are so interesting. And it's not just that, it's that Mark 16 verses 9 to 20 doesn't look anything like Mark's style. If Mark did write the longer ending of Mark, then he just decided to change his style completely at the last minute. So the vast majority of New Testament scholars are sure that the last bit of authentic Mark's Gospel we've got ends at 16 verse 8. They differ about why it ends at 16 verse 8. 16 verse 8, by the way, is the bit where the women have been commissioned to go out and tell the disciples about Jesus' resurrection. And then we have this amazing line where they say, and they didn't say anything to anyone, for they were afraid. And that's the last line of Mark's Gospel as we have it, 16 verse 8. And it's, for many years, people thought, well, even though New Testament scholars were convinced that the longer ending was later, they thought that the original ending had been lost, that got torn off or something. It does happen, you know. I mean, even today you can go into a second-hand bookstore and a bit of a page is torn out, right? So how much more is it the case, especially if Mark was on a scroll and the last bit of the scroll got torn off? It's possible. It's not a ridiculous theory, is it? And what people used to say is, well, the last word in Mark's Gospel, I mean, in English translation it's for they were afraid, so the last word is afraid. But in Greek, the last word is the word for. In Greek it's ephobunta gar, which is they were afraid for, because you can have things arranged the other way around in Greek. So ephobunta gar, so the last word of Mark's Gospel is for. Can you imagine ending a book and? Yeah, for, because. And lots of people said there's no way Mark could have ended his Gospel that way. So we have this kind of mystery. There's a scholar called Clayton Croy who wrote a book called The Mutilation of Mark's Gospel, who recently resurrected the idea that Mark ended his Gospel at that Mark didn't end his Gospel at Mark 16 verse 8, and it got mutilated. Other people think that Mark was a kind of dark dramatic genius, and that he wanted to end his Gospel with this sense of mystery. You end it with, they didn't say anything to anyone for they were afraid, and then you end this Gospel with mystery, terror, strangeness. Did they ever go and report this to the disciples? And you're left wondering. And some people think Mark was almost like a kind of a postmodern genius in ending his Gospel in this dark, dramatic way. I find that theory quite appealing myself, I must say, because I love Mark's Gospel, and I like the idea that Mark was that clever. There's a little bit of me that wonders whether it was actually a bit of a case of the visitor from Porlock. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of Kubla Khan, Coleridge's Kubla Khan. But Coleridge claimed that when he was writing Kubla Khan, that he was just coming up to writing the dramatic conclusion to the poem, and somebody knocked on the door, and Coleridge calls him the person from Porlock. Doesn't tell us, which is a town in Devon in England. He doesn't tell us who this person was or why he knocked on the door. But when Coleridge sits down to try and complete Kubla Khan, he can't do it. The inspiration's gone. The muse has left. So it remains unfinished. And there are, of course, other great works of art that are left unfinished. Schubert's Unfinished Symphony, Symphony No. 8, is a classic. It's not because Schubert died. There's a perfectly good Symphony No. 9, the great C major, which he wrote afterwards. And part of me wonders, this is really just me, but part of me wonders sometimes whether Mark simply didn't know how to end the Gospel. So 16 verse 8 is the ending of the Gospel as we have it, but he doesn't really have another ending. So what happens is he effectively invites other writers to complete his Gospel for him. an invitation that Matthew takes up by adding all the material we have in Matthew 28, that Luke takes up with greater plumb with all the stuff he has in Luke 24, and John too by adding John 20 and 21 and other gospel writers too, including ultimately scribes of Mark's gospel themselves that felt that 16:8 was not a good ending and they added their own too. So it could be that Mark simply stopped there for lack of inspiration. He may not have known how you end a gospel. How do you describe resurrection appearances? Was he just going to do 1 Corinthians 15 and list them? Or did Mark perhaps think that he'd written a kind of prequel to the well-known story from 1 Corinthians 15? If Paul is right that this was known throughout the churches generally as of first importance, could it be that Mark is just writing a kind of prequel to that? How do we get to that point? Because if you think about it, the action in Mark 16 ends at the moment where 1 Corinthians 15 picks up. Because in 1 Corinthians 15 he says, and he appeared to Peter, right? Raised on the third day according to Scripture, and he appeared to Peter. Well, that's the bit we haven't got in Mark. There's a prophecy of an appearance to Peter, but no more. So maybe Mark's writing a prequel to the well-known story, and therefore feels he's got to the end of the story. Could, after all, be that early Christians knew the story of the resurrection appearances quite well, but didn't know the prior story, and that's what Mark is trying to supply. I should say that the change in scholarship on this really comes about when an Oxford scholar, R.H. Lightfoot, wrote a brilliant article simply saying it's quite possible to end a book with the word for, even though lots of people said, no, this is quite impossible. He says, no, it works. Grammatically, it's okay. It's not brilliant, might not be in your sort of style guide, but it's perfectly okay to end things. So how do we deal with the sort of comparison between Mark on the one hand and 1 Corinthians on the other hand? One has an empty tomb and no appearances. One has appearances and no explicit empty tomb. One has women, the other one doesn't. Paul doesn't mention the young man. And the only person at all in common to the two, apart from Jesus, is Peter. So could Mark be a prequel to the action that's going on in 1 Corinthians 15? Does Mark write his resurrection story conscious of the traditions that are represented in 1 Corinthians 15 and trying to add his own special piece to that? But let's focus a bit more on this curiosity of an empty tomb. It's worth saying that the phrase "the empty tomb" is a curiosity of Christian discourse. Mark himself doesn't say, and the tomb was empty, or something like that. One of the things that's worth saying is that there's a kind of literary genius to the way that Mark tells this story, because he doesn't actually describe Jesus leaving the tomb, does he? He doesn't say, and Jesus... If you watch the end of Mel Gibson's The Passion of the Christ, apologies if you've not seen it, because this is a spoiler, but if you watch Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, you actually see Jesus physically getting up in the tomb, the stone rolling back and him walking out. The very thing Mark doesn't give you. What Mark does is the women have actually arrived too late to see the action. So they arrive and they're having this discussion, who's going to roll away the stone, what are we going to do? And they get there and the event has already taken place. Jesus is not here, is what the young man says. And he's called a young man, it's not called an angel in Mark. This language of angels only comes in later on in Matthew, Luke and John. And in Luke there are two angels, not just one, which is another curiosity. But they arrive there and the event has already happened. It's almost like if you had a camera there, the camera was switched off during all the really important events, like the stone rolling back, the body leaving and everything, and it's only switched back on again as the women arrive. So the reader has to infer what must have happened earlier on, and it's wonderful dramatically. People rarely pause to consider that Mark actually hasn't narrated the resurrection at all. He's narrated the aftermath of the resurrection. He's narrated the scene that the women are seeing when they arrive. Something has already happened. And that's Mark's choice. He could easily have chosen to narrate an earlier point, couldn't he? As the Gospel of Peter later does, when it actually tells you how the stone rolls back and Jesus walks out. And you notice the contrast all the more when you read Mark alongside Matthew, who's one of Mark's earliest readers. Matthew has a really different resurrection story. When Matthew's women arrive at the tomb, it's closed. People often don't spot this. But when Matthew's women arrive at the tomb, same women, Mary Magdalene, it's not a different group of people that have come earlier, it's the same people. They arrive at the tomb and the tomb is sealed shut. An angel comes down from heaven and opens the tomb. And there's no one in there. And then, they have the angel, tell them the story about how, he's no longer here, he's risen. So in Matthew's gospel, Jesus has presumably not walked out the front door. Because when the women get there, the tomb is sealed shut. Unless we're to assume that an earlier angel that we haven't seen opened the tomb, Jesus walks out, and then the angel closes the tomb again, and then Jesus goes off and has a bagel or something while he waits for the women. Matthew's story is a different story. It's a completely different story. So the assumption is in Matthew's gospel that Jesus has somehow, for want of a better term, got magicked out of the tomb. He's gone through the walls or something, which actually is the kind of thing Jesus does in Luke and John anyway. He appears and disappears in locked rooms. So it's a curiosity, really interesting. I wonder what is going on in Mark's account. And I should point out as well that one of the reasons why, if I could just have the lights down for a second, I want to draw attention again to real first century tombs. I talked a bit yesterday about the Talpyot Tomb in East Jerusalem, not because I think it actually is Jesus' tomb, but because it provides us with some wonderful illustrations of what at least one first century Jerusalem tomb looked like. And there you see a whole, these kohim in which the ossuaries would have been placed. And, we might think of it as a crypt, a mausoleum, something like that. And so when you look at the layout of it, this is the layout of what they call Talpyot Tomb 2, the garden tomb, which is next door to the original one that was proclaimed as being by Tabor and Jakubowicz as being Jesus' tomb. But this one, you can see you've got all of these kohim. We call them niches, I suppose, some of which have primary burials in, with skeletons and different bones, and some of which have these ossuaries in. So it's a mixture of primary and secondary burials. Now, the reason why I point it out is that people, when they read Mark's Gospel, don't imagine a real first century tomb. They imagine the kind of tomb you see in the Christian art and films. But it's very clear that this is the kind of thing Mark is describing, because he says that the women walked into the tomb, for starters. So we're not doing this cramped little one-ledge tomb that you see quite often. They enter into the tomb. And then notice the line. People never notice this. I'm going to have to write an article or a book or something like this one day, because no one ever points it out. And it seems amazing to me, since it's in the resurrection stories, which is some of the most interesting stories in the New Testament. The man says, well, first of all, they see the man standing in the middle. And he basically, so the man is kind of standing in the middle of this crypt. And he says, see the place where they laid him, pointing to the right-hand side. Now, what he's doing, let's get the pointer. What the young man is doing is, the young man is kind of in this sort of area here, at the entrance. And he's saying, see where they laid him, pointing to this, here. And they're looking. And the thing is, notice, he has to say, see where they laid him. He's pointing out which niche he's in. That's what the young man's saying. He's saying, he's not in this one, this one, this one, this one, this one. Of course, this does raise a really interesting question, if this is what Mark is describing, which surely he is, because otherwise you can make no sense of this business of him being on the right, pointing out where he was laid. You don't need to point out where he was laid if there's only one, piece there. But what is interesting about that is that therefore makes it kind of more confusing when you're talking about the idea of an empty tomb, because if Jesus is in this one here, or the equivalent of this one, who's in these ones here, all around here, right? Joseph of Arimathea's other family members, other friends, other prophets of other would-be messiahs. I mean, who's in there? You can see that Matthew and Luke and John are anxious about this question. I'll tell you why I think they're anxious about it. All three of them make a big deal of this being a new tomb. They say, this was a tomb in which no one had ever been laid. Now you read all the commentators on this and they come up with all sorts of nonsense explanations, like they wanted to show that Jesus was in a virgin tomb, just as he was in a virgin's womb. Absolute nonsense. I think that what it is that they wanted to show that there could be no confusion about this. The entire tomb was empty, because otherwise, what about this chap down here? I mean, what if you've gone into a tomb? I mean, who knows which one's Jesus' body? And you know, in the apologetics, people always say, well, you know, they could have gone to the tomb and visited. Yes, they could have gone to the tomb, but when you've got bones down there, who knows whose bones they are, right? And I mean, especially if you've not got them in an ossuary which is written on. So I think what happens is they know that this is the kind of tomb that Jesus was buried in, because that's exactly what Mark is describing. And Matthew, Luke and John all emphasize that this was a new tomb, a tomb which nobody had been laid, so that they can have a coherent claim that when there's nobody in the tomb at all, then Jesus is really raised from the dead. And that becomes important when it comes to the whole business of imagining the thing, because you could easily imagine otherwise someone saying, well, maybe he was in one of the other kochim, not in that one. And there are one or two other questions of interest in the account. One is, why does Mark go on about Galilee so much? Because you have the young man says to the women, he has gone ahead of you to Galilee. This is a really, really strange note, not least because the tradition in Paul says, and the prophecies in Mark say, that Jesus will be raised either on the third day, Paul, or after 3 days, Mark. How do the disciples get from Jerusalem to Galilee to see Jesus on the third day when you've got a Sabbath intervening anyway? They're surely not all scurrying up back to Galilee on the Easter morning. You can see that Luke's got a problem with this, because Luke just abandons the whole idea of Galilee at all. And in fact, Luke has in Luke 24, he says, do you remember what he said to you when he was in Galilee? That's the way that Luke describes it. He doesn't have this thing of, he will go before you into Galilee. Matthew, on the other hand, does have Galilee, and Jesus does appear to them in Galilee. And that's where the resurrection appearance happens in Matthew's Gospel, at least the resurrection appearance to the 12, to Peter, well, to the 11, to Peter and the others. John does both. As often, he incorporates elements from Luke's picture of a Jerusalem appearance tradition and Matthew and Mark's picture of a Galilee tradition. So John 20 is all set in Jerusalem, just like Luke 24, and John 21 is all set in Galilee, just like Matthew 28 and Mark 16. Last of all, what about the women? I do want to just spend a moment looking at the tradition of the women at the tomb. Mary Magdalene is common to every single resurrection story in all four Gospels. She's the only woman whose name is clearly in all four. And in John, of course, she becomes the chief and the first witness. And you have this wonderful romantic story of Jesus meeting Mary. She thinks he's the gardener. I knew an old priest when I was a teenager who said to me one time, do you know why she thought Jesus was the gardener? And I said, no. And he said, well, it's because when Jesus rose from the dead, he didn't have any clothes, he was naked. So he looks around the garden where he was buried, finds the gardener's shed, and puts on the gardener's clothes. Which I thought was a marvellously literalistic and amusing take on the tradition. Now, the personnel do differ, though, other than Mary Magdalene, who is common to all four. So even within Mark 15 and 16, the personnel differ a bit. So we have Mary Magdalene 3 times at cross, burial, resurrection. Then we have Mary of James the Less and the mother of Joseph and Salome. Then we have just Mary of Joseph. And then we have Mary of James and Salome. So is the underlined woman on the handout, is that the same person all 3 times? I think it probably is. And also, is it Jesus' mother? I mean, Jesus' mother is a mother of James and Joseph, isn't she? So is this Mark subtly telling us that Jesus' mother was at the tomb without telling us it was Jesus' mother? It's the kind of thing Mark might do. Bear in mind, we've had this rather bizarre thing in Mark 13, 31 and following. Who is my mother? Who are my brothers? Those who hear the word of God and do it. Is Mark being a little bit kind of naughty here, a bit underhand, and not saying it was Jesus' mother. After all, Jesus' mother is at the cross in John's Gospel with Mary Magdalene. So it could be that this is Jesus' mother, or it could just be another Mary. There were so many Marys in Palestine in the first century. They crop up everywhere, in the literary remains, in the archaeological remains. On the ossuaries, when you look for women's names, a phenomenal number of them are called Mary. Do you know 47% of all the women's names that we know of in this period are either Mary or Salome? Yeah, so we have both of those names at the tomb in Mark's Gospel. Are these names just so well known to Mark's first readers that he can just allude to them and they can just go, oh yeah, okay, it's them? It could easily be the case. Or is Mark forefronting these women as a kind of polemic against the male disciples? People often note that in Mark's Gospel, the male disciples blunder and they stumble and they keep, showing themselves to be absolute buffoons. And then right at the last minute, we have women at the key places, women at the cross, women at the tomb, and women at the resurrection. Is this Mark's way of saying that there were named witnesses at the really key moments of Jesus' life? If you think about it, Mark has got a problem in his narrative otherwise, because if all the disciples have fled, which is made very clear in Mark 14, strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. If all the disciples have fled, how does anybody know that Jesus died, was buried, and raised from the dead? So this might be Mark's way of actually affirming, no, in fact, there were witnesses, and I know their names, and here are the names. It could easily be that. Because if you think again about 1 Corinthians 15, that story of named witnesses begins with the appearances, not with crucifixion and burial. So is it Mark's clever way of saying, this really was a witnessed event? What this, of course, then does is it brings us back to the initial problem. We do seem to have named witnesses from early on claiming that they have seen an empty tomb and a resurrected Jesus. So at the end of our session, we still haven't managed to solve what actually happened on the first Easter morning. Well, thanks for listening into this latest episode of the NT Pod. That was a lecture on the stories of Jesus' resurrection. I'm grateful to the Biblical Archaeology Society for allowing me to rebroadcast it here. You can find more things like this by going to biblicalarchaeology.org. That's biblicalarchaeology, all one word, .org. Or if you're particularly interested in the videos, go to BAS Library, all one word. That's BAS Library, all one word, .org/videos. There are also lots of DVDs and other things available in the Biblical Archaeology Society store, which is store.bib-arch.org. That's store.bib-arch.org. I'll also put all the links in the program notes as usual. But thanks for listening. I'll be back again quite soon. In episode 92, I'm going to have an experiment. I'm going to try the first ever live episode of the NT Pod, and you're very warmly welcome to attend. It'll be on April the 16th, which is a Thursday. This is April the 16th, 2020, 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, and I'm going to use TalkShoe for the broadcast, be an hour-long episode. I will release it also afterwards as a recording, but you're encouraged to join me live and to bring any questions or comments that you have on the NT Pod. We can make it a bit of a feedback type episode. I look forward to seeing you then, and if not, I look forward to seeing you before too long. Thanks again for listening. Bye-bye.